We all think that we know who she is, that to see her or to hear her scream is a sure sign of our coming death. And today, she has a reputation as the scariest being in all of Irish folklore. But what if I told you that the Banshee you think you know is not at all like the ones spoken of in the oldest stories? What if the infamous, wailing spectre of death isn't the malevolent skeletal hag she's made out to be? And what if her terrifying scream wasn't a curse, but a gift? Hi everybody, and welcome back to Beasts of the Old World. If you're new here, this is a channel where we discuss ancient folklore and mythical creatures from across the globe. I'm Nick, and today we'll be talking about the infamous Banshee, who she was, who she's become, and what her evolving myth reveals about the one certainty we all face: our own mortality. As always, dropping a like and a comment is enormously helpful to the channel and will be massively appreciated. With that said, let's get into it. Long ago, somewhere over the misty hills of ancient Ireland, rumours began to spread. Rumours of something terrifying, of an omen of death. She might appear as a crooked old crone or the spectre of a young woman. Folk said that if you approached her, she would vanish into thin air, or else disperse into a fluttering murder of crows. To see her was frightening enough, but to hear her, well, that's when you really started to worry, because this was the Banshee, and her voice was death. At least, that's what we're told about her today. Pop culture loves the Banshee. You'll find namesakes and loose reinterpretations everywhere you look. From the sonic screaming Banshee of the X-Men, to the grief-hungry spirits that appear in Charmed, as well as other Banshees in games like World of Warcraft and Mass Effect. As a result, the Banshee of today has gained a reputation as a terrifying, malevolent spirit, with a scream so powerful it kills on contact. But the old tales, they tell of something very different. Stories of the Banshee can be traced back as far as the 8th century, but even this far back in the archive, reports of who or what the Banshee really is are so varied and scattered that no definitive origin can be found. Patricia Lysaght, author of The Banshee, the Irish Supernatural Death Messenger, a book generally held to be the definitive work on the subject, notes that although the question of how the Death Messenger came to be has occasionally been raised by the people, it has not been very prominent in their minds. Those even tangentially aware of this myth will almost certainly know that the word Banshee is in fact two words, ban and she, and is commonly taken to mean fairy woman. But for Lysaght, who, let's not forget, is the expert, the term is far more likely to mean woman of the other world. This is an important distinction, as we'll see later, but perhaps even more curiously, she also states that the Banshee may once have been more broadly referred to as the Bancínta, which translates as keening woman, a term now only commonly found in certain areas of Ireland. This is very curious indeed, because despite what many people assume today, there's little to no evidence in the older sources that the Banshee was ever really associated with the Fae at all. This begs the question of how much the translation of Banshee into fairy woman has skewed our understanding of who she really is. Would we think of her the same way if she'd always been called a woman of the other world, or simply a keening woman? If she was indeed once broadly known by this term, this hints at a potential origin for the myth, but more on that later. The point is that depending on where you are and who you ask, you're going to get a very different account of who or what the Banshee truly is. Some will tell you she appears as a twisted old crone. Others will say she takes the form of a young woman, veiled in black or white. Some stories say that upon approach she vanishes in a cloud of smoke. Others claim she disperses into the sound of fluttering wings, or that she takes the form of a black bird that waits on the windowsill for hours, sometimes days, before death comes to call. Despite these differences and disagreements, almost every account gives the Banshee long, white, tangled hair, and many describe her holding a silver comb. One thing that they all agree upon is that if you hear the Banshee's wailing cry, then death is soon to follow. Only, usually not yours. It's this power to predict death that earned the Banshee the chilling moniker of the Angel of Death. And while that sounds terrifying, the traditional Banshee of Irish folklore is actually a very complex figure, deeply intertwined with family and tradition. One Banshee story illustrates this complexity quite well. Set in the year 1776, it takes place on a day like any other. Mr. Harrison Ross-Lewin had just that morning gone away on business, and in his absence, his children decided to visit a friend in a village some distance from their own. They stayed with their friends until late in the afternoon, and when at last they took their leave, the sun was low and red, drawing long shadows across the land. They hadn't journeyed long before the night drew in, and the air grew chill and heavy. At once, an eerie feeling crept upon them all, for their path home was dark and narrow, lined with wild hedges and with leaning, grasping trees. Worse, it would lead them by the ancient ruins of Kilchrist Church, which folk all around said was haunted. They walked in silence through the dark, and at length caught the low sound of a fell voice carried on the air. 3 times they heard this icy, mournful wail, and each time they did so, it grew louder. When at last they reached the ruin, they saw that there upon the church's crumbling wall, a small, white-haired old woman wailed and cried. Cloaked in dark robes, she ran to and fro, her haunting voice spilling with sorrow and grief, her wild arms flailing. As you might imagine, they were terrified at this encounter, knowing in their hearts that this crone was not of the earth. Well, most of them. A couple of the older boys instead took the woman's antics for madness and decided to approach. Mustering their courage, they made towards the ruin. As they approached, the ghostly figure seemed to vanish, leaving no trace except the sound of fluttering wings. Sensing some trick, the boys scoured the church, each corner, every shadow, but they found nothing. Those who remained outside had watched the whole thing without even blinking. Only the boys entered the ruins, and only the boys returned. The old woman had simply vanished into thin air. Shivers ran down their spines, and they all rushed home. Upon their return, they saw that their mother's face was grey with worry. While they'd been away, she said, a huge raven had perched upon her windowsill, tapping 3 times upon the glass. The bird, she said, was surely a messenger of doom, and she'd been worried that the children had met misfortune on their way home. They assured her that they were all safe, though a little shaken. They began to explain that on their way home they passed the old ruin of Kilchrist Church, and there came a tapping at the window once more. The raven had returned and was watching them through the dark glass, tapping once again, and then no more. It stayed watching all night. A few days later, grim news reached them. Their father, who you'll remember was away on business, had passed away suddenly in Dublin that very same night. The Ross-Lewins knew the myth of the Banshee and had good cause for worry. But while it's true that no one was ever pleased to see her, or hear her cry, the tale is often misread today, in one key way. Because the Banshee of old was never truly malevolent. She was a mourner, said to appear only to certain ancient Irish families, grieving for them before death arrived, so that they might properly prepare themselves for the forthcoming loss of a loved one. So where did this figure come from? One theory links her to the Morrígan, the Irish goddess of battle, fate and sovereignty. There is indeed an awful lot of overlap. The Morrígan is also a shapeshifter, often appearing as a crow. She too was known to foretell death and was therefore feared, even though she was also considered sacred. A gatherer of souls, a guide to the other world. But there's another thread worth following. The Banshee's most famous trait is certainly her wail, but this is often misrepresented today. In the old days, this wasn't viewed as a scream of terror, but as a cry of mourning, more specifically known as keening. According to the Cath Marga Tored, it was the goddess Brigid who first keened, at the death of her own son. Keening is a fusion of wailing and singing, very seldom practiced today. It was haunting and poetic, a structured expression of grief. For a long time, keening was an essential part of the Irish funeral tradition. It is undoubtedly haunting, but it's also beautiful. Today, people hear the word Banshee and imagine something shrill and terrifying, but keening is nothing like that. For me, this contrast between what we expect and what we actually hear is the clearest sign of how far we've strayed from the Banshee's true roots. She isn't the shrieking demon that we've come to imagine. She's a guardian against grief, a protector of families in their darkest moments. Yes, she foretells death, but she doesn't cause it. She simply mourns it. Brigid's story may well explain where the practice of keening came from, but it doesn't necessarily explain where the Banshee myth has its source. That explanation may lie in something far more human. There was once a widespread belief in Ireland that the Banshee was the ghost of a woman, specifically that of a professional keener. As I mentioned earlier, in those days, keening was an essential part of an Irish funeral, so it shouldn't be surprising that women were often hired to wail and lament over the dead, even if they didn't know the recently deceased. Patricia Lysaght quotes a source from Roscommon that says, "In ancient times, every Irish family, that is, when someone would die in the house, would ask the local keener or crier. They were old women who were recognised for their art and were glad to be asked. The more they cried, the more drink they got. It is said, when these women died, their spirits came back to cry for the descendants of the families they cried for when on earth. A lot of the Irish families had their own keeners, and it is said that they will come back as a banshee to cry for the name until the end of time. If the name dies out, the banshee for that family will be heard of no more." That these women were often paid in alcohol might have been a major factor in the demise of the practice. and as time went on, in some regions, keening came to be seen as undignified, even shameful. It survived long into Ireland's Christianisation, but eventually the clergy came to condemn it. This gave rise to the belief in some circles that banshees were the cursed souls of these keening women. Now, Christianity did not invent the cursed soul theory. In earlier days, when a keener failed to appear at a funeral, sometimes because she herself had died, folk imagined that she would be condemned to wail forevermore as a banshee. There are other explanations too. In Kilkenny, for example, another source explains the banshee not as a keener by trade, but as a woman consumed by private grief. Perhaps a bereaved mother who never stopped mourning, or a soul whose sorrow became so great she could never really move on. As the source says, it was told that she was the spirit of a woman who had lost her family tragically and forever mourned them. If we are to look at it in this way, the banshee becomes a profound warning against the dangers of unchecked grief, and how holding on to sorrow can corrode the soul. But across Ireland, the banshee's most common association is with the family, because unlike professional keeners, the banshee rarely cries for strangers. In place after place, the stories are the same. She was one of your own kin, a friend or relation, someone who cried for your family before and now comes back to cry again. Over time, some even began to believe the banshee wasn't a ghost at all, at least not in the traditional sense, but the spirit of the family itself. This is where the core of the myth becomes clear. The banshee isn't some paranormal terror. She's not a demon or a fairy. She's kin. So why is the modern banshee so different from her ancient predecessor? And why is she portrayed in this way today? The grisly reputation that the banshee has gained through modern portrayals marks a dramatic shift from the spirit she once was. Traditionally, her role was to warn families of an impending death so that they might prepare, say goodbye, and grieve with dignity. For warriors, she offered something arguably even more profound, a chance to fight fearlessly, already knowing their fate. And yet, death has always been her domain. That part has never changed. It is in that unchanging core that we glimpse something else, the shifting shape of our own beliefs about death. Perhaps the evolution of the banshee, from a gentle mourner to a terrifying killer, says far more about us than it does about her. It's a shift that hints at a growing cultural detachment from death, a discomfort so deep we've somehow turned the mourner into the murderer. The older banshee reminds us that death is real and universal. The newer version, she reflects our own fears, our dread at what lies ahead. She doesn't concern herself with grief or watching over the family in their darkest moments. She's not interested in community. Unlike her ancestor, the modern banshee is all about personal horror. She reveals our deepest worries about death to be the preoccupation with our own, rather than the grief of losing someone close to us. In that, perhaps, we see a trace of our growing individualism, a turn inward, and a people more concerned with their own mortality than with cultural continuity. But despite the modern noise, the old song of the banshee can still be heard. These tales of grief and sorrow still echo across Ireland's misty hills, reminding us of a world much older than we realise. They connect us to that world, and to those who have come before us, now long gone. They tell us about our relationship with death, both back then and today. They remind us of our impermanence and the impact that we have on those around us in life, as well as long after we're gone. Because folklore doesn't merely preserve our past, it reveals our present, taking us on journeys through our fears, our hopes, and our deepest secrets. Today the Banshee sings quietly, if she sings at all. And if she does, then I wonder if it's not just for the dead, but also for herself, for her own loss, mourning the death of her memory as a shield of the family, as a guardian against grief, watching helplessly as her myth becomes increasingly twisted into cheap pop horror. But hopefully, through these old tales, by looking deep into our past, we can start to undo the damage done to this myth, and remember the Banshee as she truly was.